She can wait. Danielle Carter heard the words without meaning to. The woman behind the reception desk had not whispered them. She had said them casually, almost carelessly, before turning back to her computer screen. Danielle lowered her eyes and tightened her grip on the armrest of the plastic chair. The pain had started earlier that morning. At first she thought it would pass. She finished her shift at the elementary school where she worked, drove herself across town, and checked into the emergency department of St. Gabriel Medical Center. That had been nearly 3 hours ago. Now the digital clock above the waiting room television read 4:17 p.m. Around her, people came and went. A man with a twisted ankle arrived 40 minutes earlier and had already been called back. A woman complaining about a mild cough had disappeared through the double doors after only 20 minutes. Danielle remained exactly where she had been all afternoon. The waiting room smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. A television mounted high on the wall played a daytime talk show that nobody seemed interested in watching. Rain tapped softly against the large front windows overlooking the parking lot. Every few minutes Danielle shifted in her seat, trying to find a position that felt comfortable. Nothing helped. She reached into her purse and pulled out a worn photograph. It showed her and her father standing outside a small church many years ago. He had been smiling. She remembered his voice as clearly as if he were sitting beside her now. No matter how people treat you, never let them decide your worth. Danielle slipped the photo back into her purse and took a slow breath. Across the room, a young nurse glanced in her direction. Her name badge read Emily Ross. She had noticed Danielle almost immediately after coming on shift. Most patients waiting that long became frustrated. Some complained loudly. Others demanded answers. Danielle had done neither. She sat quietly, spoke politely, and thanked everyone who addressed her. Somehow that made Emily even more concerned. She walked toward the reception desk where Linda Reynolds was reviewing paperwork. "Mrs. Carter has been waiting a long time," Emily said carefully. Linda barely looked up. "We are busy. I understand, but she seems uncomfortable." Linda sighed and clicked through several screens on her computer. "Her chart is not marked urgent." Emily glanced toward Danielle. "Maybe someone should reassess her." This time Linda looked up. "Emily, there are people here with more serious issues." The nurse hesitated. "How do we know that if nobody has checked on her recently?" Linda's expression hardened. "Because I said so." The conversation ended there. Emily returned to her station feeling uneasy. Through the glass entrance doors she watched rainwater roll down the windows. Something about Danielle's situation did not sit right with her. Meanwhile Danielle remained alone in her chair. The room seemed louder now. Phones ringing. Conversations drifting through hallways. Wheels rolling across polished floors. Yet beneath all of it she felt strangely invisible. As though she had become part of the furniture instead of a patient. She looked toward the reception desk once more. Nobody looked back. Then the automatic doors opened and a gust of cool air swept into the waiting room. Several people entered from the rain. Most visitors went unnoticed. But within seconds, something changed. Staff members who had seemed relaxed all afternoon suddenly stood straighter. Conversations stopped. Even Linda Reynolds quickly rose from her chair. Danielle did not know why everyone was staring toward the entrance. She had no idea that the man who had just walked through those doors was about to change the course of her entire day. Danielle followed the direction of everyone's gaze and saw nothing extraordinary at first. The man who had entered looked more like a tired traveler than someone important. He wore a simple dark coat dampened by rain and carried no visible signs of wealth or authority. Yet the reaction around him told a different story. Linda Reynolds immediately smoothed her jacket and hurried from behind the reception desk. Several administrators appeared from a hallway that had been quiet moments earlier. Even security personnel straightened their posture. Danielle watched the scene with mild curiosity before lowering her eyes again. Whatever was happening had nothing to do with her, or so she thought. The pain that had brought her to the hospital still lingered, draining her energy little by little. She leaned back against the chair and closed her eyes for a moment. Images from her day drifted through her mind. Earlier that morning she had stood in front of a classroom filled with third graders, helping them prepare for a reading presentation. One little girl had proudly read an entire page without stopping for the first time. Danielle still remembered the smile on the child's face. Moments like that were the reason she loved teaching. The work did not make her rich, but it made her life meaningful. Her phone vibrated softly in her purse. She pulled it out and saw a text message from her mother. "How are you feeling?" Danielle stared at the screen for a second before typing a reply. "I am okay. Just waiting." She did not want her mother to worry. The truth was that she was no longer sure how okay she actually felt. Across the waiting room, Emily Ross continued observing her. The nurse had spent enough time around patients to recognize when someone was trying to stay strong for everyone else's sake. Danielle had not complained once. She had not demanded special treatment. She simply waited. Emily respected that. Yet she also worried that the quietest people were often the easiest to overlook. Near the entrance, the man who had arrived from the rain exchanged greetings with several hospital executives. He listened more than he spoke. There was something calm and measured about him. Unlike many powerful people, he did not seem interested in drawing attention to himself. Then, as he prepared to walk deeper into the building, his eyes briefly swept across the waiting room. The glance lasted only a second, but suddenly he stopped. One of the administrators speaking beside him noticed immediately. "Is everything all right, Mr. Whitmore?" the man asked. Danielle did not hear the question. She was looking down at the photograph of her father again. But the visitor was no longer listening to the administrator. His attention remained fixed on the woman sitting alone in the corner. A look of surprise crossed his face, then disbelief, then recognition. Emily noticed the change first. She watched as the man's expression softened in a way that made no sense. He took a step toward the waiting area, then another. The administrators followed, confused. Linda Reynolds looked equally puzzled. Nobody seemed to understand why one of the most powerful people connected to St. Gabriel Medical Center was suddenly walking toward a patient who had spent the last 3 hours being ignored. Danielle finally looked up when she heard footsteps approaching. The man stopped directly in front of her chair. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then a warm smile appeared on his face. "Danielle Carter?" he asked quietly. And the moment she looked at him closely, she realized she had seen him somewhere before. Danielle stared at the man for several seconds, searching her memory. His face felt familiar, but she could not immediately place it. The waiting room seemed to fade around her as she studied him. Then a distant memory surfaced. A stormy night nearly 8 years earlier. Flashing emergency vehicles. Heavy rain. A frightened little girl standing alone beside a highway rest stop. Danielle's eyes widened slightly. The man smiled. "I was hoping you would remember." Before she could answer, one of the hospital administrators stepped forward nervously. "Mr. Whitmore, we have a meeting scheduled upstairs." The man barely acknowledged him. His attention remained on Danielle. "You helped my daughter," he said softly. The words instantly transported Danielle back to that night. She had been driving home after a late school event when she noticed a child standing near the edge of a parking area during a severe storm. The little girl had been crying and unable to find her family. Danielle had stayed with her for almost an hour until emergency responders located her parents. She had never learned what happened afterward. She had simply gone home and returned to work the next morning. "That was your daughter?" Danielle asked quietly. "It was." His smile carried genuine gratitude. "She still talks about you." Around them, confusion spread through the waiting room. Emily Ross looked from Danielle to the man and back again. Linda Reynolds stood frozen near the reception desk. The color seemed to drain from her face with every passing second. Danielle glanced around the room. "I did not know who she was." "That is exactly why I never forgot it," the man replied. "You helped her because she needed help. Nothing else." For a moment neither spoke. Then his expression changed as he noticed the discomfort she was trying to hide. "Why are you sitting out here?" he asked. Danielle hesitated. She had no desire to embarrass anyone. "I am waiting to be seen." The man looked toward the digital clock, then toward the reception desk, then back at Danielle. How long? The question sounded simple, yet everyone nearby suddenly seemed interested in the answer. Danielle lowered her eyes. A little over 3 hours. Silence settled across the room. Emily felt her stomach tighten. Several staff members exchanged uneasy glances. One administrator quietly cleared his throat. Mr. Whitmore looked toward Linda Reynolds. 3 hours. Linda forced a smile that did not reach her eyes. We have been extremely busy this afternoon. The explanation sounded weak even to her. Mr. Whitmore's expression remained calm, but something in the room shifted. He was no longer simply a grateful father speaking with an old friend. He was now observing the hospital through a different lens. Emily noticed it immediately. The administrators noticed it too. Has a physician evaluated her recently? He asked. Nobody answered right away. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. Danielle suddenly wished everyone would stop staring at her. She had come seeking medical care, not attention. Yet events were moving beyond her control. Mr. Whitmore slowly nodded, as though he had just learned more from the silence than from any explanation. Then he looked at Danielle again. His voice softened. You took care of my daughter when nobody knew who she was. He glanced toward the staff surrounding them. Now I think it is time someone takes care of you. And for the first time that afternoon, several people inside St. Gabriel Medical Center realized this was no longer going to be an ordinary day. The atmosphere inside the waiting room changed almost instantly. Moments earlier, staff members had moved through their routines without paying much attention to the woman sitting quietly in the corner. Now every glance seemed directed toward Danielle Carter. She hated being the center of attention. It made her uncomfortable. She had spent her life helping other people shine. Whether in a classroom, at church, or caring for her mother at home, Danielle was always the person standing quietly in the background. Yet suddenly the entire room seemed focused on her. Michael Whitmore remained beside her chair. His expression was calm, but there was a seriousness in his eyes that everyone around him recognized. One administrator stepped forward and offered a nervous smile. Mr. Whitmore, perhaps we should continue this conversation upstairs. Michael looked at him briefly. In a moment, the administrator immediately fell silent. Nearby, Emily Ross watched everything unfold with growing disbelief. Only 20 minutes earlier, she had been trying unsuccessfully to convince Linda Reynolds that Danielle needed another assessment. Now the owner of the entire hospital was standing beside the same patient everyone else had overlooked. Michael crouched slightly so he could speak to Danielle at eye level. Can you tell me what brought you here today? Danielle hesitated. Not because she did not trust him, but because she was exhausted. The long wait had drained her physically and emotionally. I have been feeling increasingly unwell since this morning, she said softly. I thought it would improve, but it did not. Michael nodded carefully. He listened without interrupting, without checking a phone, without looking away. The simple act of being heard felt strange after hours of being ignored. Emily noticed it too. She noticed the way Danielle's shoulders relaxed slightly while speaking, the way her voice became steadier when someone finally paid attention. Across the room, Linda Reynolds stood behind the reception desk pretending to organize paperwork. In reality, she was watching every second of the conversation. Her confidence seemed to fade with each passing minute. Michael rose to his feet and turned toward the nearest administrator. Who is supervising patient flow this afternoon? The question sounded polite, yet nobody missed the weight behind it. The administrator glanced toward Linda. That was all the answer Michael needed. He looked toward Emily next. You are a nurse? Emily nodded. Yes, sir. Have you evaluated Mrs. Carter personally? Emily chose her words carefully. I observed her condition and requested that she be reassessed. Michael's eyes narrowed slightly. Requested. Another uncomfortable silence settled over the room. Danielle looked down at her hands. She never wanted anyone to get into trouble because of her. But she could feel the truth slowly surfacing whether she wanted it to or not. Rain continued tapping softly against the windows outside. The gray afternoon light reflected across the polished floor. Then a physician finally appeared through the double doors leading to the treatment area. He carried a chart and seemed confused by the crowd gathered near the waiting room chairs. "What is going on?" he asked. Before anyone else could answer, Michael looked directly at him. "Doctor, this patient has been waiting for more than 3 hours. I would appreciate it if someone examined her immediately." The physician looked at Danielle, then at the executives surrounding Michael, then back at Danielle again. His expression changed instantly. Of course. For the first time all afternoon, someone reached for Danielle's chart and called her name. But as she slowly stood from her chair, she noticed something unusual. Michael Whitmore was not heading toward the elevators for his meeting. He was following her. Danielle walked slowly beside the physician through the double doors leading into the treatment area. The sudden attention felt almost unreal. Only minutes earlier she had been another patient waiting quietly in a crowded room. Now nurses stepped aside as she passed. Administrators whispered in hallways. Staff members who had barely noticed her before were suddenly eager to help. Yet none of that brought her comfort. The only thing she wanted was an answer about why she had been feeling worse throughout the day. The examination room they entered was clean and brightly lit. A large monitor glowed softly against one wall. Medical equipment sat neatly arranged on counters. The physician introduced himself as Dr. Alan Pierce and immediately began asking questions. Unlike the brief interactions Danielle had experienced earlier, he listened carefully to every answer. He asked when her symptoms had started. He asked what had changed throughout the day. He asked whether she had experienced similar problems before. Danielle answered as clearly as she could. Across the room, Emily Ross quietly assisted with the evaluation. She looked relieved that someone was finally taking the situation seriously. Outside the room, Michael Whitmore remained in the hallway. Several executives stood nearby waiting for instructions. None of them appeared comfortable. Michael had not raised his voice once since arriving. Somehow that made everyone more nervous. Calm disappointment often carried more weight than anger. One administrator cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitmore, perhaps we should discuss this privately." Michael looked through the glass panel in the examination room door where Danielle was speaking with the physician. "We will." His voice remained steady. "After she receives proper care." The administrator nodded and said nothing more. Inside the room, Dr. Pierce reviewed Danielle's chart. As he flipped through the pages, his expression gradually changed. "You arrived over 3 hours ago?" he asked. Danielle nodded. "Yes." The physician looked at the timestamp again, then at Emily, then back at the chart. Something about the timeline clearly bothered him. Emily could see it. Danielle could see it too. A few minutes later, additional tests were ordered. Nurses moved quickly. Equipment was prepared. The room became busy with activity. Danielle sat quietly on the examination bed while everything happened around her. For the first time that day, she felt less invisible. Yet she could not shake the thought that none of this would be happening if Michael Whitmore had not walked through the front doors. The realization saddened her more than she expected. Outside, rain continued falling against the hospital windows. The evening sky had darkened into shades of gray and blue. In a conference room upstairs, hospital leaders gathered around a long table. Reports were being pulled, schedules reviewed, questions asked. Michael had requested a complete summary of patient wait times from that afternoon. Nobody knew exactly what he intended to do with the information. Then a nurse entered Danielle's room carrying preliminary results. Dr. Pierce reviewed them carefully. His expression grew serious, not alarmed, serious. He immediately requested another specialist. Emily noticed the change and felt her stomach tighten. Danielle saw it too. "What is it?" she asked quietly. Dr. Pierce offered a reassuring smile. "I want another physician to look at something. That is all." But after he stepped into the hallway, Emily overheard part of his conversation. "She should never have waited this long," he said. The words stopped her cold. And as Michael Whitmore listened from only a few feet away, he slowly turned toward the administrators standing beside him. For the first time that evening, The disappointment in his eyes was impossible to miss. The hallway outside Danielle's examination room grew quieter as the evening wore on. The rush of activity that had filled the emergency department earlier seemed distant now, replaced by the steady hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional sound of footsteps moving across polished floors. Inside the room, Danielle sat alone for several minutes while additional evaluations were being prepared. For the first time all day, nobody was asking her to wait. Nobody was telling her to sit down and be patient. Yet strangely, she did not feel triumphant. She felt tired, deeply tired. She looked toward the rain-covered window at the far end of the room. Water slid slowly down the glass in long silver streaks. The city lights beyond the hospital blurred into soft colors. Danielle reached into her purse and removed the photograph of her father once more. The edges were worn from years of handling. She traced her finger lightly along the image. Her father had passed away 5 years earlier, but some days she still heard his voice as clearly as ever, especially during difficult moments, especially when she felt unseen. "Never let bitterness become your identity," he used to tell her. "People can fail you without defining you." Danielle smiled faintly at the memory. It would have been easy to become angry, easy to focus on the hours she had spent being ignored, easy to replay every dismissive glance and every delayed response. But sitting there beneath the soft hospital lights, she found herself thinking about something else. Emily Ross, the young nurse, had tried to help. She remembered the concern in Emily's eyes, the hesitation, the effort. Sometimes one person choosing to care made all the difference. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. Emily stepped into the room carrying a cup of water. "I thought you might need this," she said. Danielle accepted it with a grateful smile. "Thank you." Emily pulled up a chair beside the bed. For a moment neither spoke. Then Emily looked down at her hands. "I am sorry." Danielle blinked. "For what?" "For not doing more sooner." The words came quietly, honestly. Danielle studied her for a moment before shaking her head. "You tried." Emily's eyes lifted. "It did not feel like enough." Danielle smiled softly. "Sometimes trying is what matters most." The nurse looked away briefly, fighting unexpected emotion. Nobody had ever thanked her for trying before. Most people only noticed success or failure. Very few noticed effort. Outside the room, Michael Whitmore stood alone near a large window overlooking the parking lot. The executives who had followed him throughout the evening remained several feet away, unsure whether to approach. Michael barely noticed them. He was watching the rain, watching the ambulance lights reflect across the pavement below, thinking. The events of the afternoon troubled him more than he wanted to admit. St. Gabriel Medical Center was not supposed to operate this way. He had spent decades building a healthcare system around dignity and compassion. Yet today he had watched a woman sit in pain for hours because nobody believed her situation deserved attention. The thought weighed heavily on him. Then Dr. Alan Pierce approached carrying a folder. Michael immediately turned toward him. "How is she?" he asked. The physician looked relieved. "The good news is that we caught the issue before it became more serious." Michael exhaled slowly. "And the other news?" Dr. Pierce glanced toward the administrators standing farther down the hallway. "The other news is that her concerns were valid from the beginning." Silence followed. The rain continued falling beyond the glass. And for the first time that evening, Michael Whitmore realized this was no longer about one patient. It was about a system that had stopped listening. The realization stayed with Michael Whitmore long after Dr. Pierce walked away. He remained standing beside the window while rain continued tracing thin lines across the glass. The city beyond looked distant and blurred beneath the evening sky. For years he had visited hospitals throughout his healthcare network. He had attended ribbon cuttings, fundraising events, board meetings, and community programs. Everywhere he went, people showed him polished presentations and impressive statistics. Yet none of those reports had prepared him for what he witnessed today. A woman had entered seeking help. She had spoken respectfully. She had followed every instruction. She had waited patiently, and somehow the system had failed to hear her. Down the hallway, Danielle was finally resting comfortably. The tension that had tightened her shoulders all afternoon had begun to ease. Additional evaluations were underway, and for the first time since arriving at the hospital, she felt confident that someone was paying attention. Emily Ross checked on her several times during the next hour. Each visit was brief, but Danielle appreciated them. The young nurse no longer looked uncertain. She looked determined. Meanwhile, on the administrative floor, an emergency meeting had quietly begun. Department supervisors gathered around a conference table while managers reviewed patient records from earlier in the day. The atmosphere was tense. Nobody needed to be told why they were there. The events unfolding downstairs had already spread throughout the building. Linda Reynolds sat near the far end of the table. She stared at a printed report without truly reading it. For the first time in years, she found herself replaying ordinary decisions that she had never questioned before. Which patients received immediate attention? Which concerns were dismissed? Which voices seemed easier to overlook? Questions she had never asked herself suddenly became impossible to ignore. The conference room door opened. Michael entered without speaking. Every conversation stopped immediately. He walked slowly toward the head of the table and placed a folder in front of him. Nobody moved. Nobody looked away. "I met a woman today," he finally said. His voice remained calm. "Most of you know who I mean." Several people lowered their eyes. Michael looked around the room. "What concerns me is not that she experienced a delay. Hospitals are busy. Delays happen. What concerns me is that multiple opportunities existed to hear her concerns, and those opportunities were ignored." Silence followed. The words were not angry. Somehow that made them more powerful. Back downstairs, Danielle received an unexpected visitor. Michael appeared at her door carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Emily and smiled. "You have had a long day." The nurse laughed softly in surprise. After Emily stepped out, Michael sat beside Danielle's bed. For a moment neither spoke. Then Danielle looked at him. "You did not have to stay." Michael smiled faintly. "Years ago, during the worst night of my daughter's life, you stayed with her until help arrived." Danielle looked down at her hands. "Anyone would have done that." Michael shook his head gently. "No, not everyone would have." The room fell quiet again. Outside, the rain was finally beginning to stop, and as the clouds slowly parted above the city, Michael realized that Danielle had given him something far more valuable than a chance to repay an old kindness. She had shown him a problem hiding in plain sight, one that could no longer be ignored. The next morning arrived with a quiet stillness that felt completely different from the tension of the previous day. Sunlight filtered through the large hospital windows, replacing the gray rain clouds that had covered the city for hours. Danielle woke to the soft sound of nurses changing shifts in the hallway. For the first time since arriving at St. Gabriel Medical Center, she felt genuinely at ease. The evaluations performed overnight had provided answers, and her condition was improving. More importantly, she finally felt heard. Emily Ross was one of the first people to stop by that morning. She carried a small paper cup of coffee and a smile that looked far less burdened than it had the day before. "How are you feeling?" she asked. Danielle smiled. "Much better." Emily nodded with obvious relief. "Good. That is what I wanted to hear." For a moment they simply enjoyed the calm. Then Emily glanced toward the window. "A lot happened because of yesterday." Danielle looked down at the blanket covering her lap. "I never wanted anyone to get into trouble." Emily understood. That was exactly the kind of person Danielle was. Even after everything, she seemed more concerned about others than herself. "This is not about punishment," Emily said gently. "It is about making sure people are treated the way they should be." Later that morning, Michael Whitmore called a meeting involving department leaders, physicians, nurses, and administrative staff. The conference room was completely full. Some people arrived nervous. Others arrived curious. Everyone understood that something important was about to happen. Michael stood near the front of the room holding no notes and displaying no presentation slides. He simply looked around at the people responsible for caring for thousands of patients every year. "Healthcare is not built on buildings," he began. It is built on trust. The room remained silent. Yesterday reminded me that patients do not judge us by our mission statements. They judge us by whether we listen when they ask for help. Several people lowered their eyes. Others nodded quietly. Michael continued. One woman waited hours while trying to explain that something was wrong. She was polite, patient, respectful. Yet her concerns were not treated with the urgency they deserved. Nobody needed him to say Danielle's name. Everyone knew. This conversation is not about one employee, Michael said. It is about culture. If a patient feels invisible, then we have failed before any treatment even begins. The words settled heavily throughout the room. Even Linda Reynolds listened without interruption. For perhaps the first time in years, she was hearing criticism not as an attack but as an opportunity to reflect. After the meeting ended, Michael walked through several hospital departments speaking directly with nurses, technicians, physicians, and support staff. He asked questions. He listened carefully. He wanted to understand how small decisions became larger problems. Meanwhile, Danielle prepared to leave the hospital. Emily helped complete the final paperwork. As they stood near the discharge desk, Danielle noticed how differently people interacted with one another. Conversations seemed more thoughtful. Staff members paused longer when patients spoke. Perhaps it was temporary. Perhaps it was only the beginning. Either way, something had changed. Before leaving, Danielle stopped near the front entrance. Morning sunlight streamed through the glass doors. She turned and noticed Michael standing several feet away. He smiled warmly. "Thank you," he said. Danielle looked surprised. "For what?" Michael glanced around the hospital lobby. "For helping us see what we were missing." And in that moment, Danielle realized that the greatest change had never been about her treatment alone. It was about what happened when one overlooked voice finally forced an entire institution to listen. 3 months later, the memory of that rainy afternoon still lingered inside the halls of St. Gabriel Medical Center. Not because people talked about it every day. In fact, most patients who walked through the hospital doors had no idea it had ever happened. What remained was something quieter, something harder to see. Small changes had taken root throughout the building. Nurses spent more time listening before typing notes into computers. Supervisors reviewed concerns more carefully. Staff training sessions focused less on efficiency and more on empathy. The changes were not dramatic. They were human, and sometimes that made them far more powerful. On a bright Saturday morning, Danielle Carter stood in her classroom arranging books on a shelf while sunlight poured through the windows. The school year was nearing its end. Children's artwork covered the walls in colorful patterns. Laughter echoed from the hallway outside. Everything felt normal again, exactly the way she liked it. One of her students approached carrying a reading assignment. Danielle knelt beside the girl and patiently helped her sound out several difficult words. Moments later, the child smiled proudly after finishing the page on her own. Danielle smiled back. Some things never changed, and she was grateful for that. Later that afternoon, she visited her father's grave carrying fresh flowers. A gentle breeze moved through the trees overhead. The sky was clear and bright. She placed the flowers carefully beside the headstone and stood quietly for a moment. There was no speech, no dramatic declaration, just gratitude. Gratitude for the lessons he had taught her. Gratitude for the strength to remain kind when it would have been easier to become bitter. Gratitude for the reminder that dignity never depends on how other people treat you. Across town, Michael Whitmore sat in a conference room reviewing reports from hospitals throughout his network. The numbers showed improvements. Patient satisfaction scores were rising. Response times were improving. Yet the document that held his attention most was a simple handwritten letter resting beside his laptop. It had arrived several weeks earlier. The letter came from Emily Ross. She wrote about why she became a nurse. She wrote about the responsibility of speaking up when something feels wrong. And she wrote about a patient who reminded her that every person deserves to be heard. Michael folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside its envelope. Some lessons could not be measured by statistics. As evening approached, Danielle walked through a neighborhood park on her way home. Children played near a fountain. Families gathered beneath trees. The golden light of sunset stretched across the grass. She sat on a bench and watched the world move around her. A familiar peace settled over her. Her phone vibrated with a new message. It was a photograph from Michael. His daughter, now older and smiling brightly, stood outside her school holding an award certificate. Attached beneath the image was a simple message. "Thank you again." Danielle smiled and placed the phone back into her purse. The sun slowly disappeared below the horizon. Warm light reflected across the pond in front of her. Somewhere in the distance, church bells began to ring. Danielle sat quietly, listening. No applause followed her story. No crowd celebrated what had happened. The world simply continued moving forward. Yet, in that peaceful silence, there was something beautiful. One woman chose kindness years ago without expecting anything in return. That kindness eventually returned in a moment when she needed it most. And as the final rays of sunlight faded across the water, the only thing left behind was the quiet certainty that compassion never truly disappears. It simply waits for the right moment to come home.